Добрый день, Major. Rad videt. Our French intelligence confirms the Allied forces are developing two vehicle weapons. The phase transport and the chrono tank. It is not in the Soviet interest that either of these weapons becomes operational. Do what you must. Steal the prototypes. Use the prototypes against the Allies. And keep them from using that chrono tank. Iditai, go on.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Vehicle report. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
New construction options. Building. Construction complete. New construction options. Building.
Affirmative.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Base is under
Acknowledge.
attack. Prepare.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Awaiting orders. Yes, sir. Vehicle affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Ready and waiting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Reporting affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Reporting.
Building.
At once. Very well.
Waiting
Affirmative.
order. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Ready.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Acknowledge.
Building.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Waiting order. Affirmative.
Naval unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Comrade. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Mission accomplished. Reinforcements have arrived.
Awaiting orders. Reporting. Affirmative. At once. At once. Yes, sir. At once. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Agreed. At once. Affirmative. Very well. Yes, sir. Very well. Agreed. Very well. Agreed. Affirmative. Very well. At once. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Very well. Agreed. Very well. Of course. Very well. Affirmative. At once. Very well. Affirmative. Very well. At once. Agreed. Very well. Agreed. Affirmative. Very well. Agreed. Agreed. Very well. Very well. Yes, sir. Very well. At once. Agreed. At once. Very well. Affirmative. Affirmative. At once. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Of course. At once. Very well. Agreed. Agreed. At once. Yes, sir. Agreed. Affirmative. Agreed. At once. Very well. Affirmative. At once. At once. Affirmative. At once.
Vehicle report. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
40
Affirmative.
minutes
Affirmative.
remaining.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Reinforcements
Affirmative.
have arrived. Reinforcements have arrived.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Yes. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Report. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Mission accomplished.
Awaiting orders. Comrade. Comrade. Affirmative. Affirmative. At once. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting well. Waiting. Acknowledged. Very well. Very well. Comrade. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Affirmative.
Acknowledged.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Need a
First
jump?
objective met. 10 minutes remaining.
Comrade, acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Republic. Affirmative.
Naval unit
Awaiting
lost.
orders. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Naval unit
Acknowledged.
lost.
Acknowledged.
Warning, 5 minutes.
Affirmative.
Naval unit lost.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Warning, 4 minutes remaining.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Waiting order.
Let's dance. Power on. Let's dance. Power
Warning,
on.
3
Burn, baby,
minutes remaining.
burn. Let's dance. Lights out. Burn, baby, burn. Power on. Fully charged. Fully charged. Let's dance.
Warning,
Power
2
on.
minutes remaining.
Jockey. Lights out. Extra jockey. Power on. Jockeying. Burn, baby, burn.
Waiting
Warning,
order.
1
Affirmative.
minute remaining.
Acknowledged.
Reporting.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Reinforcements have
Acknowledged.
arrived.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Base is under attack.
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Awaiting affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Waiting affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Reporting. Affirmative. Vehicle acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Waiting order. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Waiting.
Lost.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Vehicle report. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Mission accomplished. Reinforcements have arrived.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Comrade, affirmative.
Engineering. Affirmative.
Affirmative. At once.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Affirmative. Agreed. Affirmative.
Waiting acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Of course. Ready and waiting.
Comrade. Affirmative.
Engineering.
Waiting
ready.
orders. At once.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Reporting well.
Engineering. Affirmative.
Reporting. At once. Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir. At once.
Acknowledged.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Affirmative.
Ready and waiting. Affirmative.
Waiting. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Acknowledged. At once.
Comrade. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Ready and waiting.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Awaiting orders. Reporting. At once.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Engineering. Yes, sir. Engineering. Affirmative.
New construction options.
Engineering. Affirmative. Engineering. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Training.
Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Engineering. Affirmative.
Training.
Affirmative.
On hold. Training.
Ready and waiting.
Unit ready. Training.
Engineering. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir.
Training.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Agreed. Agreed. Affirmative. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative.
Our base
Yes, sir.
is under attack.
At once. At once.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Affirmative. Ready and waiting. Ready and waiting. Orders. Acknowledged. At once. Acknowledged. Agreed. Ready and waiting. Yes, sir. Very well. Awaiting orders. Very well.
Engineering.
Repairing.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Chronosphere charging.
Ready and
Reinforcements
waiting.
have arrived.
Yes, sir. Awaiting orders. Very well. At once. Very well. Agreed. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Chronosphere ready.
Agreed. At once. Very well. Very well. Agreed. Agreed. Of course. At once.
Select target.
Vehicle reporting.
Charging. New construction options. Building. Construction complete. New construction options. Training. Building. Construction complete. Our base is under attack. Training. Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Repairing. Chronosphere ready. Construction complete. New construction
Waiting
options.
affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir. At once. Agreed. Agreed. At once. Agreed. At once.
Construction
Agreed.
complete.
Affirmative. Very well.
Our base is under attack. New construction options.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Repairing. Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Very well.
Unit lost. Unit lost. Training. Unit ready. Training.
Yes, sir.
Unit
Unit waiting.
ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Very well. Agreed. Very well.
Training. Our base is under attack. Construction
Vehicle
complete.
affirmative. Affirmative.
Training. Construction
Affirmative.
complete.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Waiting order. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Waiting order.
Yes, sir.
Waiting affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Training. Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Select target. Select target. Chronosphere charging. Unit lost.
Awaiting order. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Training. Unit ready.
Reporting.
Vehicle reporting.
Engineering. Affirmative.
Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Chronosphere ready. Chronosphere
Engineering.
charging.
Affirmative.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Primary building selected. Training.
Reporting.
Unit ready.
Engineering. Affirmative.
Training.
Engineering.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Engineering.
Construction options.
Comrade. Acknowledged. Comrade. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Comrade. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Chronosphere charging.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Our base is under attack.
Waiting affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Training.
Comrade.
Unit ready.
Reporting.
Training. Chronosphere
Yes, sir.
ready. Unit
Acknowledged.
Comrade. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit
Yes,
ready.
sir.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Waiting order. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Engineering. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Engineering. Affirmative. Engineering. Affirmative.
Construction options.
Waiting affirmative. Comrade, affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Comrade, affirmative. Waiting affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Base is under
Acknowledged.
attack.
Affirmative. Reporting. Comrade?
Select target. Chronosphere
Yes, sir.
charging.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. At once.
Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Ready and waiting.
Fully charged.
Comrade?
Don't you? Fully charged.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Construction complete.
Comrade, acknowledged.
Got juice? Fully charged. Burn, baby, burn.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Affirmative. 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 Reporting. Waiting for affirmative. Affirmative.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
select target. Chronosphere. Charging.
Affirmative.
Select target. Reinforcements have arrived.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. At once. Very well. Reporting once. Of course. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Very well. Of course. Of course. Agreed. At once. Affirmative. At once. Agreed. At once. Yes, sir. Agreed. At once. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. Yes, sir. At
Chronosphere
once.
ready.
Agreed.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Engineering. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Mission accomplished.
You have been busy, comrade. I am to present you with this Soviet star in recognition of your efforts in keeping the Allied dogs from completing development of their new toys. You have done well, my friend. Yet, too well. Soon you will have this drafty corner office, and I will have to start worrying about my own job.